Okay, welcome everyone. We'll start a little bit early. My name is Toby Dodge, and I teach international relations here in the International Relations Department. But much more importantly, I'd like to introduce my old friend Ahmed Tabaqchali, who is going to speak on the ongoing research project on Iraq's economy that he's running here in the Middle East Centre. The title of his talk tonight is Iraq's Economy Between the US and Iran, Perception and Reality. Now, he won't be as unsubtle as this, but I can say it rather more boldly and less academically, that he's going to critique the assumptions and the basis to Trump's incoherent, more incoherent than usual foreign policy. But more to the point, before we start, I want to draw your attention to the outputs of Ahmed's research project, which are free to air, sitting behind you on the table. A fistful of dinars, demystifying Iraq's dollar auctions, and Big Bad Wolf, or is it, Iran's economic footprint in Iraq. So tonight, what we're getting is a further development of Ahmed's research agenda. So Ahmed is a visitor. We're very proud that Ahmed is a visiting fellow at the London Middle East Centre and has been for some years, and a capital market professional. He's also, not as important, a senior fellow at the Institute for Regional and International Studies, IRIS, and a little bit more impressive, but still quite not as impressive, being at the LSE. He's a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council in Washington, in the Iraq Initiative. And he's also a board member of the Iraqi Fund for Higher Education and the Baghdad Business School. So given all that he's doing, we're very lucky to have him here in London this evening. So Ahmed will talk for 20 minutes. So while you're listening to him talk, please ask questions and get ready to interject and put under strain his suppositions. If you're timid while you're gathering your thoughts, I've got a couple of tough questions for him. But without any further ado, let me hand over to Ahmed. Thank you very much for taking the time to be with us, boss.
Thank you all for attending. I'm thrilled there's more than 2 people here, but that's quite good. But also thank you, Toby, for the wonderful introduction, Nadine for all the work done, and the colleagues at the Middle East Centre who helped out take these papers out. And I'm pretty sure that the editing has been quite impressive, given how much of a pain I am normally with editors. Okay, so the whole idea is to talk about perceptions and realities of Iran's role in Iraq, and that's why I used in the last piece Big Bad Wolf, or is it in a way? Because basically the assumption is, and okay, now I'm going to be less subtle, but Team Trump, or Trump's second administration, has a group of people. Some of them are, to me, seems to be more of a pragmatist, rational, as well as you have the ideologues who are driven by that. And the question is, where do they go in terms of when it comes to Iraq? Where do they go? Where do they fit? Would they be the ideologues who are going to win, or would be the pragmatists? I mean, so far what we've seen is the pragmatists seem to have the upper hand, at least visibly. I mean, you hear the talk this morning, or that actually they are talking directly to Hamas, but that means the pragmatists have taken over. It doesn't mean, though, by the way, given the unpredictability of this administration, that will be the case. So how does it mean for Iraq? For Iraq, the way I sort of look at it is almost everybody who covers Iraq and Iran, the assumption is the American foreign policy views Iraq through an Iranian lens. I mean, we're always viewed from that point of view, and the history with Iran goes back to the conflict that they have with the Islamic Republic since 1979. It's driven by that, and even in a way, a wonderful phrase which I borrowed from somebody who's done a lot better work than I do, I'm sorry, who uses the concept of the ideology of confrontation. And that's on both sides, by the way, on the DS and on the Iranian. But basically, a basic assumption of the and that's something I'd like to challenge in my piece, in this discussion, is the fact that Iran's political dominance translates to an economic dominance. I mean, I'm not going to argue the politics. I think with Toby and others who've done that work. But my assumption is, or my thingy is, really, is it true? And you'll see, by the way, I'm sure any of you, I mean, and I've seen it multiple times in other articles, and even when you have people, I mean, even researchers I mean, not economically, but when they discuss Iraq, they always say Iran uses Iraq for two things. One is an economic lung. I'm pretty sure you must have heard that phrase, economic lung. And the other one is to access dollars, which is really where it comes to us. But in a sense, I mean, just look at the concept of the idea of a lung, right? And what I try to do in a way is to put things in perspective, not to say that's not the case, but put them in perspective. So in perspective is this: last year, 2024, Iran sold an average of 1.6 million barrels a day. The buyers of that, 95% plus, according to reports, are China. Now, we don't know the price they sell at, but we can make assumptions based on discounts and what have you. They probably bought something like $36 billion worth of oil from Iran. Additionally, they buy something called LPG, about $3 billion. This is from Iranian data that I've got from Iranian export data. And an additional $11 billion import from Iran. So if you add them all up last year, China bought $50 billion worth of stuff from Iran. The payment for that goes through a very complex web of financial centers and stuff, and they get paid for that. They get that money. They don't take, by the way, they don't get it inside Iran. Why would they want it inside Iran? Why would Iran use dollars inside Iran? They need it outside, so it stays in banks and other places. And I'm not going to discuss that, but that is the lump. Compare it to Iraq. What did we do with them last year? Last year, again, I'm using estimates on gas and electricity imports because the 24 data is not out. But roughly, we would have bought $3 billion worth of gas and electricity from them, right? And we don't really pay them that money because according to the waivers we got from the US, that money sits in the Trade Bank of Iraq and now in other banks. I'm not allowed to touch it. That money stays there and it's only gets used if they allowed to buy stuff that are okay under sanctions, under the sanction. Private sector, we imported $7.7 billion worth from them, estimates, but based on Iranian data for up to year end. So who is the lunk? Where does Iran get dollars from? Gets from Iraq or really gets it from China? So I'm not really going to come and say, no, it doesn't get from Iraq and stuff like that. What I'm arguing is put in context. The real lung for Iran, if you're fighting Iran, is China. China is really where that $50 billion worth versus 7. And the 7 billion we do, or 7.7, is we buying stuff from Iranian merchants. So we buy tomatoes and cars and bits and pieces. That doesn't go to the government directly. So anyway, put it in context in a way, and that argument always gets aired without context. So let's go in there, by the way. The thing is, for us, Iran's footprint in Iraq is real. Having what I said there doesn't mean that it's not real. Our dependence on the Iranian gas is very serious, very critical for us. At some stage, Iranian gas and electricity accounted for 40% of the electricity generated. That's a significant amount. Secondly, is we also depend on imports. There are Iranian imports, there are Turkish imports, there are Chinese imports, all of it. We almost import everything, hardly make any. The point I'm going to make is, and again, is the second point to the earlier one, is these are a function of our own political economy, our failure as a country in managing our political economy. We depend on import. We depend on that. We mismanage our electricity sector in every way. It is not, by the way, subject to some sort of Iranian strategy or long-term. Everybody talks about the long-term Iranian strategy to dominate Iraqi economy. They are inept in managing their own economy, just as we are. The blackouts that Iran has, I mean, everybody who looked at it last year they had blackouts up till now, rolling blackout. And what are the reasons for the blackouts? Underinvestment, mismanagement, irrational policy. It's almost reads like Iraq's fate. So to ascribe it to some sort of Iranian design is completely meaningless. And the reason I say that's important is if we as Iraqis or as Iraq's friends, let's say, international partners, if they want to help us out, attacking Iran directly won't solve it. And I'll come to bits and pieces where it won't. It won't solve it. If you really want to help Iraq to become independent and all that kind of stuff, we need to address our own issues as a country. We haven't done them. We've come close in 2020 when we had a disaster, but we never followed through with them. So, I mean, how am I doing for time?
We have another 10 minutes.
Oh, okay, so I'll really go quick now. So two things, which is quite important. One is it affects us in gas and electricity. as I said, the loss of waivers, if they don't renew them at the beginning of the next month, we will lose that. But the good news is that we will lose them anyways, because Iran will not be able to supply gas to us this year. They have their own issues. And secondly, it will be quite bad for us. But the reality is, all the discussions the Americans have had with us, and I think we always as a country should be proactive. We're not proactive, we always react. We sit there almost like, I would say, sitting ducks waiting for something to happen, or more likely, we bury our head in the sand hoping for the best. And when we talk with Americans, like the last time when they started the waivers and what have you with us, we never discuss with them the fact that we will never be independent of gas. We will always need gas because the big issue we have is a gap between supply and demand. Supply growing much faster than demand is growing, and there will always be a gap. So the answer is not replacing Iranian gas, but diversifying, i.e., we work with Kurdistan on resolving the issues we have to get gas from there, to get gas from free gas, and so forth, and import gas from others. This administration, by the way, is quite transactional, and so we can import natural gas in terms of liquefied natural gas from them or from Qatar. That could involve building infrastructure, which we could all do with them. So we need to be proactive, we're not. And in a sense, that will put us in no trouble because right now, all our responses are reaction as opposed to being proactive. And I think we need to, but the recognition clearly is that we cannot be independent. The fact that we emerge from conflict and we have population growth, we will always have big demand for electricity. It's far more than anything we can have. But the idea is diversified. So we will not be subject to anybody's control over us one way or the other. Now, the thing is, again, comes to the thing. If you saw the directives that they had when they imposed maximum pressure, two things were there. At least how it affects us. One was unlikely to renewal of waiver, but the other one was not to allow Iran to use the Iraqi banking system to siphon dollars. And that will hit us in many ways. Not because it's actually true, in a sense, but because perceptions matter. Everybody has all these continuous discussions about where we are. Now, the thing is, we need to be proactive, as I said. One of the things that we're not proactive in a country, we always look for magical solutions. We as a country, we export oil. We've come up with discussions, we'll do it in yuan or we'll do it in various currencies. The fact of the matter is, most trade in oil will remain in dollars. Not because of some American conspiracy, but because all physical markets are in dollars, but far more important for those who do financial markets. The financial markets in oil are something like 25 to 20 times as big as oil markets. And all of these are traded in dollars. So it means everybody who buys our oil, one way or the other, will use these markets to hedge their purchases. So you will never escape the fact that we will depend on the dollar. That's one. Secondly, when it comes to reserves, our reserves, yes, I mean, those who read the other piece, which came out 2 days ago, on what I called Empire Strikes Back, basically looking at our reserves. Only 4.2% of our reserves directly are with the Federal Reserve, but 90% of all of them are priced in dollars. And again, you hear people talk, we should diversify all the kind of magical, again, solutions. And the fact of the matter is, the US markets are the most liquid and the deepest market and the most convertible. So if we have spare money, most likely it's there. And that's why even China, with all the conflict it has with the US, most of its reserves are in dollars, simply for the same thing. So we will always be dependent on the dollar and subject as such to American policy. But instead of sitting down and waiting for things, we need to be proactive in managing them. One of the things that happened in a good way, and I'll come to it in a second, is what happened to the auction in November 22. But before then, I'm sure all of you have read about the auction. I mean, you've seen some investigations and reports of how the auction is all corruption and all that kind of stuff. I'm not denying there is no corruption, but let me just divert a little bit and go on other stuff as well. Last year, in the US, a bank called TD Bank, which is one of the top 15 banks in the US, a Canadian bank, settled $3 billion settlement with the regulator. And the reason is that they've been systematically failed to do anti-money laundering. They've been on the radar screen of the authorities since 2013, discussed with them, and if you read the details of the case, through the lack of proper systems, and they've described as systematic failures, which means system-wise, helped launder something like $700 million for drug smugglers. In 2012, HSBC settled $1.9 billion with the regulators. Again, what's the reason? Is they've laundered, or not laundered, forgive me, they've helped facilitate billions of dollars of trade for Iran, Sudan, and other countries and so on. As well as they bought a bank in Mexico and systematically classified Mexico as a low-risk country, which meant, by the way, hundreds of millions of dollars for drug dealers. Again, I mean, one third example, I'll end there. Danske Bank in Europe, it's one of the Denmark's largest banks. Its branch in Estonia, I think, something like $200 billion worth of transfers done for Russian oil. The point I'm trying to say here is nobody argues that the biggest banks in the West are hotbeds for corruption and anti-money laundering and so on. Most of the people here probably would have a bank account with HSBC. Yes, banks have that. That doesn't say, by the way, what happened with our guys is right. But again, perspective. Just because all the investigations, I've seen the investigation, the report, I'm pretty sure are all good. But none of them talk of anything more than tens of millions of dollars. So they come up with tens of millions of dollars worth of fake invoices, etc., all the kind of stuff. And then you write the report that this $80 billion worth of transfer we did last year were all smuggled and fake monies. What really ails, and I think I have about 5 minutes left, what really ails us in the auction, and by the way, it's not an auction, it stopped being an auction in 2004, but names are impossible and habits are impossible to die. But the thing is, the auction itself is our interaction with the outside world. What happened, and again through the real issue of what is wrong with the auction is we are mostly an informal country. Our economy is informal, and yet the access to dollars is formal. So how does the informal economy access dollars formally? And that is really, when you hear reports of all kinds of fake invoices and stuff, yes, they're right. But underneath them, actually, there is a whole economy. When people look at Iraq, and most investigations I've seen, when they look at the auction, they take Iraqi data from the Ministry of Trade, which is wrong and misleading in many ways, because the Ministry of Trade data does not include the Kurdistan region. It means all our trade that goes with Turkey, which is probably the top or second largest importer, doesn't get recorded. A large chunk of our trade with Iran doesn't get recorded. And then you have all the trade that comes by planes, because the region, the KRI, has a lower tariff structure than the rest of the country. All of these are not recorded. So if you record the data, you'll see a ton of trade goes underneath it. Also, Iraqis are the largest purchasers of real estate in Turkey, as all the Iraqis would know. Most Iraqis have flats and properties in Turkey. How do they pay for those? Iraqis are one of the largest owners of properties in Dubai and the UAE. UAE as well as Jordan. Where do they pay for those? So they look at $30 billion and they go, oh my God, 30 billion here, 80 billion goes to the auction, or the rest is fraud. No, it's not. That doesn't say whether there isn't fraud. I'm sure there is. But you need to put it in perspective. What happened is, and that's one of the few times where we were proactive, but not really, is when the Americans forced us in November 22 to implement standard that we should have done years ago. They ended up with cleaning most of the auction. And again, most of it, not all, was cleaned in a way. And we've seen the massive change in banking that the country has seen. Anybody who sees Iraq nowadays sees that we have a banking system that's finally begun to take real. The banks that do all the business are banks that actually deal with proper banks outside the world. So but right now, last year, 70% of our transfers are with banks that have correspondent banking relationships, which means that all the transfers that go outside Iraq are reviewed by Iraqi side, by the US banks, as well as by an entity chosen by the Fed. That we didn't have before. So that's one of the ways when we became proactive, but without really meaning it. And I think if we become proactive, others, we can solve things. I'm looking conscious of time, so
1 minute left.
okay, 1 minute left. Where do I do that? Right. So, end of the day, we are subject to US pressure. We are dependent highly on the US, but there are solutions to that if we are proactive. But we're not. And that's really where the damage was comes.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. I should have said this beforehand. We're recording this, and so if you're going to ask questions, which I'm sure you will, keep the recording in mind. Nadine's been taking pictures as well, so if that's a problem, they'll go on our website, let her know, and we can strike you from the record. I raised my voice because I'm not used to technology, and those of us who are watching on Zoom, I'm a little bit disappointed in the thousands of you out there who have yet to post a question. So please get on the keyboard and post a question. So we have, because Ahmed's been so good with time, about 40 minutes. Let me remind you of his wonderful tour de horizon of Iraq. Firstly, Iraq is a Chinese land, not an Iranian land.
Yeah.
And $50 billion a year.
24. That been less, more different years.
Okay, all right. That serves me right for quoting him back his figures. I think that's the first big claim that we should. If the Trump administration was serious about targeting Iran, it would be complaining about China more than it is. Secondly, and I think the big thing that we need to think about, and I think Ahmed is very timely in his strategic intervention, as he highlights, the Trump administration's policy is very much work in progress. A lot of us, especially conversations I've had with Ahmed since the trauma of the election result and the inauguration, trauma of me at least, I cannot speak for Ahmed's political view, were around a much more radical, much more hard-hitting American policy towards Iraq and Iran. Now, Trump has imposed maximum pressure, reimposed maximum pressure, signed an edict, but anyone who saw that press conference, I was certainly amazed by the ambiguity that he expressed, Trump himself, in moving towards reimposing sanctions on Iran. Clearly, in this division that Ahmed mentioned between the pragmatists and the ideologues, the pragmatists at the moment are in the ascension, personified by, as Ahmed says, the negotiations with Hamas and also Witkoff's prevalence in Middle East policy and the diplomacy that he's promoting. So my first question to you, to Ahmed, while you're collecting your questions, so I'll be taking questions from you in a minute, is if the ideologues do gain the upper hand, it was my assumption that they would, how will we know? What would be the first big policy decision?
Well, the first one will be not renewing the waivers. That'd be the first one.
But you just told us that doesn't matter.
It doesn't matter, but for us politically it matters in Iraq. We know that then, as we say, IFHE harb, we know very well that actually they mean business when they do that. But the first thing they could hit us with is what they threatened in was 2020, some sanctions that make Iranian sanctions stay. But when it comes to us directly, it'll be in our transaction with the outside world. If they put restrictions on our transfers, then we have a serious problem because we import everything. All our money is pretty much one or the other in dollars. So even you've seen in my report that, as I said, for only 4.2, we have more in the Bank of France than we have in or Bank of France than we have in the US. But it's in dollars, most of it. So transfers we would be subject, and that would be a crucial thing for us. Having said that, the fact that, as I said, almost all our transfers now are done through, they're reviewed by an agency chosen by the US Fed. So realistically, and I'm here talking rational, realistically, if the entity was chosen or nominated by the Fed, and anybody who does this business can look at the entity called K2 Integrity, they review almost everything. So what you see basically is Iraqi banks, okay, let's assume they are fairly weak, which they're not all of them are. They review transfers, then they're reviewed by K2, and then they're reviewed by the correspondent bank, which mostly is the big banks like Citi and JP Morgan and stuff. So what new would come in there, I don't know. Because realistically, if they've done your way, according to your ways, what can you add? Having said that, we've seen what happened with that meeting with Zelensky. So everything is possible in this administration, and they might come up with some sort of thing to freeze it, and that would hit us quite badly if that happens.
Right, so we'll now open up to the first round of questions. I note our friends on Zoom are still not participating.
Are they there?
No, well, I assume they are. So if you ask a question, I ask two things of you in return. One, it is a question, so it starts and ends with a question mark. It's not a statement of outrage or your own opinion. And two, before you ask that question, you just give us a brief, again, the stress is on brief, introduction to who you are. So who would like to? Yes, you said.
Yes, thank you. My name is Majd Shafiq. I'm an advisor to Jordan Kuwait Bank, which is majority owner of Masraf Baghdad. Thank you. Of Masraf Baghdad, Bank of Baghdad. I have a question related to the Iraqi banking sector, if I may. Apart from the sanctions, we noticed that probably most of the revenues are off-balance sheet revenues in the sense that they don't rely on classical banking, deposits and lending. They focus on FX and transfers and trade finance, etc. Do you see that business model changing anytime soon? Are they going to revert to a more slowly, gradually to on-balance sheet revenue streams? Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you very much for making good use of our expertise. We'll take another two questions before we come back to the speaker. So,
thank you. My name is Ahmed Tabaqchali. I am the group head of sanctions at a fintech based not too far from here. So, what you mentioned before, the potential of sanctions or further sanctions on Iraq. I think Iran is fairly straightforward. I think we've seen the Trump administration make at least indications that that is their direction of travel with respect to sanctions, and we know things in Russia may be changing as well. Do we really think there would be any potential for increased Iraq sanctions over the next couple of years? Like, do we think that's an actual practical probability?
excellent. And the third question from the audience, and then we'll come to what is now a flurry of questions on Zoom.
Thank you.
Yes, there you go.
Sure, you go. You be quite ready.
One of you, I don't care who.
My name is Sami Ibrahim. I have an interest in Iraq for the last 15, 20 years, maybe longer. One of my masters was basically on Iraq, actually, paper. So my question is about the currency exchange rate between the Central Bank of Iraq and the black market rate, which is floating at the moment. Do you find the obstacles within the rate of being 1,320 to the dollar and the black market rate being an obstacle in trade of import and export? And my understanding there has been some recent changes. Could you shed light into those changes?
Excellent. I'll come to you first after this round, Doctor. But that three excellent questions and detailed and informed questions. So I'll hand over to our esteemed speaker to answer them in great detail.
I like that, esteemed speaker. I'll remind you of that next. Okay, now the question that you said on that's true, but it's changing, and it's changing because of the changes I mentioned earlier in November 22. Structurally, as a country, we don't use banks. So the banks don't have the wherewithal to act as banks. So we don't have a deposit base, so to speak. We don't use the banks for settlement. And structurally, we have many, many issues. So the banks, most of them had to survive on basically fee income. That's however it's changing. And the reason it's changing is precisely as I said earlier, the unintended consequences of the decisions taken on the transfers. And the reason for that is one of the things is the government acted in the sense of one of the ways is trying to move away from cash. So we're using electronic payments, we're using cards, and those who see Iraq you will not believe how different it is from, let's say, 3 or 4 years ago. So yes, as that happens, as the bank become more real, i.e. they have more deposits, more they begin to lend, and then you solve the issue that we have there. So eventually it's going to go there. I think it's going to come sooner than expected, but it's definitely happening. Now, in terms of sanctions and on Iraq like that, I cannot see a scenario whereby we will be classified as a, let's say, an evil regime, like as they did with the Iranians, as they did with the Russians. I can't see circumstances where they say, yes, the ideologues will go in about the country is controlled by politicians who are aligned with Iran and so forth. But even that argument, if you stick with it long term enough, you don't see it. I cannot see that happening. But again, you're not dealing in my sense. I mean, if I was talking rationally, I think that's the answer. But given sometimes some of the irrational stuff we've seen, it's difficult to see. But however, having said that, what I've seen so far, there have been no actions indicating like that. And we have actually sort of played ball. So Marco Rubio's discussions with our Prime Minister focused on three things. One, control Iran. And the other one is encourage the resumption of oil export to the Kurdistan region of Iraq. Actually, two things. And if that's the case, we've sort of said yes. And we've done that before we did that. So in a sense, I can't see how. I mean, always now, but I can't see how. In terms of the exchange rate, if you look historically, the difference was about 2% between what's called the parallel market rate and the official exchange rate. That has shot up. Why? And again, because what I said earlier, in the thing in November, where it stopped the access of the informal economy, access to dollars on the formal economy. So the exchange rate shot up because people had to find money or dollars from other sources. Over the year, and answer your question, a lot of the companies in Iraq that were informal have become formal. So there's a huge move towards formality. And I think your bank, you'll ask your colleagues and they'll tell you sometimes they have staff till 1 o'clock in the morning, opening up accounts and dealing with new accounts and so on. So that solves part of the problem. But the reason the difference is, I don't think it impedes trade as long as the company is formal or acting formal, because Iraqi companies, even formal Iraqi companies, act sometimes informally because they want to avoid paying taxes and so on. The 15% difference or 13% difference encourages them to become rational. But also we do $7.7 billion of trade with Iran. And if we've done that, then means it will always be. So that trade will be affected. I think so far hasn't been affected. But I don't see how it can affect the other trade that are as formal. So if you are formal, you have no issue accessing dollars formally or properly. So no, it will not, but it will be a factor. A stability factor because people will always complain about.
And the third question about the exchange rate.
Yeah, that was on the
Oh, yeah, okay. All right. So after encouraging people to ask questions from Zoom, I now have 4, so I'll just read them out. Apologies to people on Zoom. If you had come in person, you wouldn't sufferingly be preaching your question. But Tariq Al-Bay says the current Iraqi tax and investment laws are archaic and discourage foreign capital from getting heavily involved in the economy. Overhauling the tax laws to offer incentives to foreign business and startups would offer an easy win for government. There is no question, but I'll just add that. Do you agree?
Yes, I agree. And the other thing is I can't see it in my lifetime changing in a way. Because the way we move, I mean, anybody who's watched how we do laws, the only laws that we pass are meaningless laws. But every law goes and stucks and stays forever. So I don't have much hope in us changing our laws significantly, but there's always works a way around them of accepting them as they are and dealing with them. I can't see that changing today. And maybe not my lifetime, but yeah. Well, I mean, I certainly hope we will, but
this is the most pessimistic I've seen you in terms of the possibilities of economic change.
Let me give you one simple example. We have a holding company law. And an archaic one. And so Parliament worked on changing it, and most of the time it changed to a rational law. And then, because the way our Parliament is, somebody injected a condition in the law that says limiting foreign ownership to 49%. Instantly, you've killed any interest in anyone to start to help a startup company because we have a new emerging economy. When you limit that, so that's the issue we have that I feel in Iraq is that yes, we have people who work on the right stuff, but then the way Parliament works,
Okay, so yeah, I'll not pick you up on just blaming Parliament. But the next question by Omar Al-Handal is, given the saturation of Iraqi banks in Iraq, how many banks do you think would be ideal for the economy going forward?
Well, the thing is, we are, as a country, we're both underbanked and overbanked. And I know this comes out silly, but most of us still do not use the banking system as such. And we have too many banks who service a small group of them. I think ultimately, if you look at, let's say, Bank of Baghdad, we need something like 20 of those banks. Because the country is large. We are 45, 46 million people. And the use of banking is only beginning to happen right now. So our figures is, I mean, I would imagine maybe 10% of the population, 15% of us use banking system. We can grow a lot more. So we need stronger banks. Our current banking structure will have to change because the banks that live on services, unless they reinvent their systems and invest in people and stuff, won't be there.
Okay, I've got three more questions here, then I'll come back to the audience. So we've heard that Iraqi plans to start governmental dealings in euros. Will such plans go forth in an increasingly strained EU-American relations? Hold that and I'll get the other. Jamil Amir advertises his podcast, which I won't do, but he says, how much of maximum pressure can we view as rhetorical and how much real policy? Well, that's a good question.
Yeah,
and then
very good question.
do you think today's geopolitical shifts would drive the Sudani government to be productive in financial reform? And do you envision a case where enough political will exists? And I'll add to that, do you think the Sudani government will last a year?
Well, the last one I can't answer, so that's easy.
What do you think? Do you think there will be a Sudani second term after the election?
Yeah, that's outside my depth, so I have no idea, and I can't comment on that. But historically, last prime minister in second one, so I don't know. I don't really know the answer to that. I think it's unlikely, but I don't know the answer. Now, in terms of the euro, yes, we can use the euro, but keep in mind the issue we have with almost one of the things that people don't realize in dealing in any other currency. Let's say we did with the euro, our import from all of we import something like 60% from basic three countries: Iran, China, and Turkey. The rest from everybody else. No other country has more than 2.5%. So ultimately, if they buy our oil in euros, as I said, most of the financial markets are in dollars. So we'll always, one or the other will be linked to the dollar. And secondly, what do we do with the euros after that? Most of the time, I mean, with euro relatively easy, we can buy US assets, the euro assets, so that can work. Because if we sell them $20 billion worth of oil and we only buy 10 billion from them, what do we do with the other 10 billion? In euro, we can, because we can put them in there. And yes, it can be there. But ultimately, the financial markets are in dollars. And that's really what determines oil prices. So ultimately, I can't see us really leaving that behind. Not now, anyways.
Okay, we've got two more questions, but we'll put to those to one side and we'll throw it back open.
I haven't answered the financial reform. The financial reform, by the way, will happen. Whatever you've seen, and I know Jamal fairly well, whatever you've seen happening since November 22 in terms of making the Iraqi dinar as the currency should be used in starting salaries and making payments, that's a very positive step, encouraging the adoption of e-payments. Almost all government departments, one or the other, mandate e-payments. All of that is a huge, huge positive. How far it goes, I don't know, but so far the trend is going the right way.
Okay, so suddenly you become optimistic.
Well, I mean, there are some things, because then the optimism is we can't change laws, but we can work with the regulations. The laws are very difficult to change. You have to go through parliament, and you've seen how parliament works with our laws. So laws are very difficult. The regulations are easy.
So do you think the legacy of the Sudani government will be this move towards e-banking?
I think that certainly is a huge win and a huge positive for them, because unlike other, or potentially, they've accepted the changes. Ideally, what it should be is that we should be proactive and working on those beforehand. But the man came to power when he was, the first thing he was hit was by that. So they embraced it. And I think that's a positive thing.
Excellent. Thank you. Right. So, oh yes,
Yeah.
sorry.
Hi there. So my name is Adil Salim, and in addition to being a long-term admirer of Dr. Tabaqchali's work, I'm a partner at Hogan Lovells International, based in London. I'm disputes partner at our financial institutions practice. So much of what we've been speaking about has been of great interest to me, and I focus in my practice on the Middle East and focus on Iraq as a very interesting market. And my question actually stems from the very last words that you uttered, Dr. Tabaqchali. You mentioned the word proactivity. And the question I've got is, what does proactivity look like if you are the state in terms of trying to keep yourself off the naughty step or on the right side of US policy here in respect of the actions being taken towards the financial sector? or indeed, if you are a market participant, whether that be a bank, private bank, or other, what does proactivity look like in order to enhance your position going forward?
Good question. Right, sir.
Hi, my name is Ahmed Tabaqchali, and I'm the think tank specialist at the Qatar Embassy here in London. My question is really focused on the de-dollarization and dollarization of Iraqi economy. So in the past 3-5 years, essentially since COVID, there's been quite a significant transformation in the region and beyond on the use of the dollar for different use cases. Most recently, we've seen Iran and Russia sign quite a strategic deal to trade in national currency. Now you can use your Iranian bank card in Russia and vice versa. China has had a very great run with Russia. The Russians today use quite a lot of the Chinese currency. There are talks now even with Syria becoming part of that arrangement as part of, I guess, maybe bargaining with the West or whatever. In your speech, you said that you don't foresee that Iraq will abandon reliance on the dollar, which is obviously not necessarily the case in the near term. But for example, a event like a war in Taiwan or something like that might accelerate de-dollarization in the world, just like the war in Ukraine did, just like the war in Syria, did in Ukraine did to some countries, or like Saudi Arabia, which is now listing companies in Shanghai and Hong Kong. There's quite a significant move happening around the region and in the world. The question is, how would that affect Iraq and Iraq's stance vis-a-vis Iran? Thank you so much.
Thank you. And one more from the audience here. There you go.
Hi, Ahmed. This is Rawaz Rauf. My question is actually about the state-owned banks in Iraq, especially Rafidain and Rashid. Do you expect any certain sanctions to be put around them, given that there's a lot of talk about them generally?
Excellent. So how do you keep off the naughty step? I think especially if you're a market participant, but also the state.
Well, most banks, or the one, for example, like Bank of Baghdad and others, have already started that ages ago. So the banks that are doing all the business now in Iraq, or most of the transfer business, are banks that have already are part of larger banks, and they followed international standards. They've been, I mean, you look at Bank of Baghdad, look National Bank of Iraq, and others, they've had correspondent banking relationships with JP Morgan and Citi, not today, years ago, which meant, by the way, correspondent banking, for those who don't know, is like a marriage that you can never, very hard to divorce from. So basically meant that they work closely with them. They have the right systems and stuff. It's not hard, by the way, to do that. When I say on the government to be proactive, not all the government, but I mean, as I mentioned, we happened in November 22. The demand was for us to actually fully be in line with everybody else. But that was supposed to have happened 2 years earlier, or even before that. Had we been proactive before then, we might have avoided that shock. Because what happened, if you see the transfers, suddenly we had X amount of transfers and they were suddenly crushed. That shook the system quite badly. And then we had to run almost like headless chicken for a while to deal with that issue. So, but the thing is, the writing was on the wall. It was clear how the world interacted. It is not hard to be proactive when it comes to these things. But what happens sometimes with us when things are quite good, we don't, as I said, we don't move. We always react. So when the Americans came to us and said, be independent on gas. I mean, themselves, by the way, the Americans themselves are not independent. They depend, I read this morning somewhere that they import something like 3,300 gigawatts from Canada. Europe depends on Russia for a long time, and now depends on the US. But nevertheless, instead of going on that long argument of replace Iranian gas and having fights with Iran with that, we could have worked well on the assumption that we will never replace the need for foreign gas, one way or the other. But we can work on our system, making us really where the issue is. And I'm not going to details on that, but there's solutions there. So it's not that hard, not I see it. It's not rocket science. There is a will. If it is there, it can be done. Now, on the alternative currencies and stuff, the problem, for example, when you look at Russia and China and you're using it as an example of successful move away from the dollar, the Russians have no option. And what they do, by the way, they export more oil to Russia than they import stuff. Sorry, export more oil to China than they import stuff from China. But they have no option but to buy the stuff from China. So their use of China, of the yuan, is not by choice. They have no choice. Also, you've got to keep in mind, the Chinese currency is not fully convertible, which means you can't buy Chinese assets that easy. So even foreign investors who invest in China on the mainland, they have to be such qualification, which means you can't sell and buy your assets. Like if you build up a surplus, you can't buy and sell just as that if you are using E1. So yes, I think on the margin, but ultimately the biggest issue when it comes to something like oil or other commodities, Qatar and everybody else, is that the futures markets and the financial markets are in dollars. Have you seen anywhere any gas or futures contract apart from those that are in China traded in?
BRICS wants to do their own thing, so
Good luck.
Trump was saying.
I mean, the thing is, I don't mean in a bad way, by the way, in good luck in a sense, there has to be a logical need for it. You have logical need, I'm not gonna go on, but they have to have a reason, and the reason why the US currency, yes, in time, you will get a marginalization of it, but I don't think it's gonna be fast, because ultimately it's the assets. If you build up surpluses, where are you gonna put your money? Where are you gonna put it in? How easily can you get in and out?
If I move you on to the last question about the likelihood of state-owned banks being sanctioned, and two were mentioned, but we could broaden it up to the State Bank of Iraq and the Trade Bank of Iraq, which we can, let's broaden it.
Well, keep in mind, by the way, Trade Bank of Iraq was created because of the issues that Rafid and Rashid had. So even if today they get sanctions, they don't do any business outside Iraq. So it's meaningless. We have to work on reforming them. They are ancient machines and they have the same illnesses that the states have, but it doesn't make a difference whatsoever. So they can't be sanctioned. Trade Bank of Iraq, yeah, that's serious because Trade Bank of Iraq handles all our trading, all the government trading is with the Trade Bank of Iraq.
Central Bank of Iraq?
Again, how? Yes, irrational people can come in and argue, but if the Central Bank of Iraq is following everything that they've done, most of the time, actually since 2015, those who remember, there was an issue during Daesh's time when we had shortage of access to dollars. We've been working very closely for them on everything, and everything that the Fed and the Treasury have instructed, we have followed. So unless they come and tell us that the Fed and the Treasury have been wrong, which they can, by the way, if they have Elon Musk on their side, they can easily do that. But realistically, how? I can't see. Logically, I can't see it how.
I'll come back to the audience to prepare some more questions, but I'll go to Zoom as well. Haider Al-Shakri apologizes for not walking a short distance from Chatham House. But asks a question. But asks a question anyway. He said recently concerns have emerged about declining central bank reserves, with some politicians accusing the current government of excessive spending in their 3-year budget without long-term planning. How accurate are these claims, and to what extent would a drop in oil prices further strain the country's financial stability? And I add this myself, or blow it out.
Yeah. Okay. I think in a sense, our reserves are still very healthy. If you look at the piece I just sent out, again, I'm advertising it, the price tracks back, you see we are at $99 billion. They are extremely healthy right now, but yes, they will go down. The relationship between reserves and oil prices is indirect. The way it works, and very simply, is basically we sell oil in dollars, then the oil, and we transfer it to dinars. The transfer process creates the reserves. The reserves are not oil revenues, they're completely separate, they're created by that. And then what happens when we import stuff, we exchange vice versa. So reserves go up as long as our income is higher, our imports are lower. When our income drops with lower oil prices, and we spend the way we are spending, then our reserves will drop and they could become serious at the current rate sometime closer to 2030. Most of the talk in Iraq is they blame the government, but Parliament approves the budget. Parliament could easily cut expenditures. Parliament hasn't got the right to increase the budget, but it can right to decrease. They have done nothing like that. So I think everybody in our spending is completely illogical. It will bankrupt us one way, and only question of how long, when would that happen? With high oil prices or relatively high oil prices around current levels, we have a long years to come, but it will happen. And because we spend far more than what we earn logically.
This is the third time you've blamed Parliament. And I wonder when you blame Parliament, who do you blame? Because-
No one.
See, if I were blaming the British Parliament, people would ask me to blame a specific party. Or the general incompetence of politicians, which is you and out, I suppose, so that would be it. Right, more questions?
Hello there. My name is James, and I'm here on behalf of the IBBC, the Iraq Britain Business Council. I had a question about sectarianism in Iraq and how high on the list is sectarianism or sorting out sectarian issues on the list of proactivity in terms of sorting sectarian issues out so that Iraq can be dealt with differently by America, by the US. Does that make sense?
It does, but it's not my area. So.
Oh,
Okay.
well,
I mean, yeah.
there were two questions. Someone else kindly asked you to ask the question I asked you to begin with about will Sudani get a second term? The answer is probably the same. I've been possible. But,
Yeah, well, I mean, you know more, and I'll argue, yes, you're quite right in that.
okay, all right. So to what extent would American policy favour the Kurdish regional government or indeed the political party in Erbil, and how might it do that? We might get a different answer.
Yeah, I mean, that would be through the resumption of all exports and the American companies working in Kurdistan. That would be an angle that they can go in a way, because historically the region has a much stronger relationship with the US than the other political parties in Iraq or the other sects in Iraq.
Okay, we have any more? Yes, please.
My question is around, basically you said that US is now interested to the transition to basically invest in Iraq, and in order like to be more active in the energy sector. So who's doing the facilitation from your experience? Who should be doing this facilitation? Who should validate these opportunities to US government? And do you think they're still interested? Because once upon a time they were there investing actively and they left them. They are interested to come back, and if they're interested to come back, who's doing the facilitation? Because we signed a $1 billion deal agreement with IFC, and there's lack of understanding between the government and international institutions like that in terms of implementation and execution.
IFC, for those in the audience who don't know the abbreviation.
International Finance Corporation.
Thank you.
Iraq, we have, I mean, when you look at investments in Iraq, you need to look at two things, and very differently. First of all, you look at oil companies. All companies' investment in the country are very different than anybody else's. They are the only, relatively speaking, sort of success story. Why? Because it's one of the issues that we have is the prevalence of corruption in almost every aspect of working. With the oil companies, most of the time, that is sort of carved up or sort of like ring fenced in a way. But it's difficult for people who look at oil companies and say whether they're investing or not. Keep in mind, most Western companies signed contracts with Iraq in 2009. Those who were in, let's say, in southern Iraq in 2009, and Kurdistan between 2006 and all the way to 2012, having different fundamentals. Those who invest in southern Iraq, that was during 2009 when everybody thought that demand for oil would be rocket sky high and there'd be no supply. They signed deals that were not very advantageous. Those who signed contracts in Kurdistan, they expected the region to be, and it was at the time, the promised land in oil, that they're going to have Ekmos oil. As it turned out, the geology was very complex. The results were disappointing, and things have changed. Also, oil companies, generally speaking, the environment for them has changed in a way through the concept of green transition in a sense. The funding for oil companies has dried in a way, forcing them to go into other areas. So that drove a lot of their thinking. So in Kurdistan, it was the fact that what they thought the sky was, the limit, turned out to be there was a limit. There was actually very exciting opportunities. They were very real, but they were nowhere near as big as people thought. And so therefore the disappointment and the changes is there. Subsequently, it's been the failure to pay them continuously. The issues that Kurdistan had with the oil companies goes on for quite a while. On the southern Iraq, the issue was, one, they signed deals that they shouldn't have signed at the time. We kept on changing the terms. But you can't produce this much, you can do this and do this, which changes their economics. So they've left. Are they coming? If the opportunity is right, they definitely are there. So you look at Total, by the way, is involved in one of the most exciting projects in Iraq, and not because of gas or because of electricity, but because of the water injection. They're going to be resuscitating a project that is going to be 5 million barrels a day, which basically will keep our production running, because without injection of water into the oil fields, our production will go down. So they are there. BP is back in Kirkuk because they see the opportunity there. The other companies, I think they'll take time in how they deal with Iraq, because the complexities of dealing with us. And I mentioned, like, the regulations and the rules. The regulations are easy to change. The law is impossible. It takes, well, not impossible, but I haven't seen any example of a law that's been passed in time or as intended. But the opportunity is real. The country is 46 million. I was on a recent trip to Baghdad, and I sat next to a Lebanese businessman who has a family business that basically sells food items as well as detergents and stuff like that. What he told me was last year, the first 4 months of the year, they met their budget for the full year. That's how exciting the country was and how promising. So yes, it will happen. But I think that one is going to see people will eventually, you'll see people who export stuff to us, and then gradually you'll see more.
My question was who's doing the facilitation to validate opportunities and to help American companies?
Well, there's going to be the chambers of commerce of their side and our side. They keep on coming to Iraq, they keep on visiting, but I haven't seen anything yet. But I mean, you don't need to facilitate it in a sense. I mean, the companies that are doing business in Iraq, those who are exporting and making a ton of money, they're there already. They don't need to facilitate it.
It would be a brave American company to invest in Iraq, given the profound insecurity being driven by the lack of policy and the potential for very destructive policy.
And by the way, I'm LSE.
Excellent. That's why the question was so good. We are now wrapping up. You've already had a question, and you've had a question, but you haven't had a question, so you can ask the final question, and I'll bring up one question. And of course, Ahmed will be around for individual conversations afterwards.
To be fair.
You haven't asked the question either. Why are you so shy? Right, so one last, you don't want to ask a question? No, go on, ask the question.
My name is
and
Tamira
then,
Shawi,
and then we'll run out of time, so you may not get in on the wire, because I've got two questions from Zoom.
My name is Tamira Shawi, and I'm an accountant, director of TI Accounting Services. I can see the movement in the bank and the improvement, how the country is dealing with improving the banks. But I just want to ask how they are dealing with the businesses there. And will there be any obligation for the businesses to pay tax? And any needs for accounting system following the international standards in Iraq? Is this something that you can see happening?
And very quickly,
yeah, you mentioned the Total project. I know Exxon tried to finish it, but didn't really succeed.
Yeah.
I wonder what you think of the ambitions that Iraq has to increase their oil production in a time when OPEC's influence on the oil markets is weakening. I wonder how likely it is.
right, great. You don't get a second question, but there is a question from, there's two questions which I will cunningly wrap into one.
Okay.
So the first question is, when will oil exports restart through the northern pipeline? But of course, the second question is, will they, when they do start, improve support for the KRG from the US administration? So all or none of them, but use that in your last minute or two to sum up and.
Minute or two.
Yeah, okay, no, all right, minute.
Yeah.
Just to sum up with, and what's the last point that you want to leave us with, that we carry home on this now?
Well, I mean, the accounting thing will happen and it takes time, but it's going to happen. It's taking slowly. We have gap, we have things, we pay taxes, and stuff is moving towards the right way. Not all companies are paying taxes, but they are moving on the right way. So that's happening there. In terms of the style deal, yes, I mean, it's very important for us in so many ways. And yes, Exxon failed for a number of years. And one of the reasons was the economics didn't work. The idea Exxon was going to do 9 million barrels per day, and it took forever. The Total deal is, you see nobody mentioning the oil part. Total deal has 4 elements. There's oil, there is gas, there's solar energy, and there's water. The real thing that's the sweetener, the thing that made it happen is the oil. The oil actually pays for all of that. So we managed to find a formula whereby it works. Otherwise, nobody would have done that project. So that formula quite worked. Will the KRG all resume and they would help the relationship? Yes, they would resume because there's an incentive on the Iraqi, on the government side, because the federal Supreme Court has mandated that the government should pay the Kurdistan salary, irrespective of there's oil sales or not. So
when will the pipeline happen?
it'll take time. Don't believe it'll happen tomorrow after tomorrow. Will need to solve 2 things, or actually 3 things. One, you have to deal with the oil companies. Yes, Baghdad and Erbil have made an agreement on the budget, but nobody has signed a contract with the oil companies. The oil companies have a number of issues that has to be addressed, i.e. how they're going to pay, how frequently they'll get paid, and the mechanics. So that's very complex. And we have other issues to deal with, i.e. the pipeline is going to be used. That's 60% owned, at least within Iraq, by Rosneft or by a company that's actually now, I don't know, they've changed ownership, but that's an issue, as well as the issue of Kurdistan's debt. They have debt about $3 billion to oil traders who actually have ownerships that way. So you have a lot of things to solve before we get there. But if they do, and likely they'll do because the pressure is there, they can come up with something else.
Yeah.
I think months more likely, years no. But I mean, it's possible, but I can't see it straight away.
Okay, excellent. What's the final thought you leave these good people with?
Well, things are going well in Iraq otherwise. They are, because ultimately, I mean, I think the one thing that happened with us playing ball, the question is what makes us play ball. The one thing that happened right for us is when we were forced to play like everybody else when it comes to our banks, how we interact with the outside world. That unleashed a massive change in the economy, because without a banking system, there is no private sector, there is no economy. And the banks, once they become proper banks, i.e., as we discussed earlier, the banks actually issue loans and receive deposits, then you can use a banking system, and then our economy will expand significantly. So if we do all the other stuff, it can happen. So one thing is happening, and I can see it on a daily basis.
So that's a good note to end on. We have 3 final thanks. First, I'd like to thank Nadine, wherever she is, for organising this.
Okay.
Secondly, I'd like to thank you, the audience, and our somewhat timid friends on Zoom for all the questions. I thought they were very well informed. And most importantly, I'd like to thank Ahmed, who in detail and honestly and very clearly, I think, answered all your excellent questions. So thank you very much, Mr. Tabaqchali.